Hello, everyone. Good evening to those who are tuning in from Manila, like some of us, and good day to those joining online from around the world. My name is Harjeet Singh, Global Convener, Fill the Fund Campaign and Founding Director for the Sampada Climate Foundation. Welcome to the Fill the Fund press briefing, organized on the eve of the historic 9th board meeting of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage here in Manila. As you know, we are dealing with an urgent crisis. We are standing at a very critical juncture. On one hand, the fund is finally operationalizing, but it's also facing a huge question of scale and access. We know that frontline communities in developing countries are facing unprecedented climate disasters. Yet the financial mechanism that we have in place is not able to support them. And there are still many restrictions that we see on our road to access that money. And as civil society, we see there are three core battles, and especially as the board meets this week. Number one, scale of finance. We need a long-term resource mobilization strategy that moves past token drops in the bucket that we see right now. And second, the speed. Just to remind everybody, it has been 3.5 years since we got the decision to establish the fund at Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt in 2022. And we are now only beginning to provide money, and we'll hear more about that. And second, connected to that is how do we reduce the turnaround time when countries make a request? How can we provide them money much, much faster than what we are able to do right now? And third is access. We need real access. Money must not get trapped in bureaucratic bottlenecks. It must directly reach countries and local communities who need it most. And to discuss all that and to unpack what is at stake over the next 3 days, we are joined by an incredible panel of experts. Richard Sherman, who is the board member of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. He's a veteran climate finance expert, and you will find that. He's the member of the South African delegation to the UNFCCC and also lead coordinator of climate finance. So Richard is a veteran climate finance expert. As I said, he's member of the South African delegation to UNFCCC and lead coordinator on climate finance for the Africa Group. And he's also former co-chair of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage and former lead advisor to developing country, co-chair of the Green Climate Fund. We have Maria Teresa Nera Loron, and popularly we call her Tetet. She's the advisor with United Nations program of Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. She's also a veteran development worker and policy expert with 30 years of experience mobilizing grassroots social movements and civil society around financing for development and human rights. And a very important connection with the Loss and Damage Fund. She serves as an advisory board member of the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, which is a sister body of the fund. And we see a lot of coordination happening between the two. We have Brandon Wu, Director of Policy and Campaigns, ActionAid US, who oversees research and advocacy on global equity. He focuses heavily on public finance, particularly the delivery part, loss and damage response, and also rights of the historically marginalized populations. He served as a GCF civil society active observer. And last but not the least, we have Liana Scheletek, Associate Director, Heinrich Boll Stiftung, Washington, D.C. She is also a long-time expert and veteran on international climate finance architectures with over 2 decades of experience in global governance. And she particularly focuses on gender transformative finance and has also served, like Brandon, GCF civil society active observers, and both of them bring a wealth of experience. Okay, we'll transition to Richard to understand what is really on the negotiating table starting tomorrow onwards, and to set the context and walk us through the key agenda items at the 9th board meeting, or B9 as we call it, the core demands of developing countries, and how we make sure that this fund remains fit for purpose. Richard, you have 15 minutes. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Harjeet, and good evening, good day, colleagues from wherever you are joining the world. First of all, let me say thank you very much to Harjeet and our fellow colleagues from civil society and the colleagues from Fill the Fund for organizing this press conference and giving me the opportunity to speak to colleagues about the importance of the meeting that's going to start tomorrow here in Manila. As Harjeet said, this is our 9th meeting since the board was formally established, and it is historic because it's one step closer to achieving our interim objectives for the fund to be fully operational and to support the funding requests of developing countries that are experiencing the ravages of climate change and are suffering from loss and damage. I think it's very important to note that the point in time that we are at now as the globe is that last week we saw the discussions in Washington, D.C. at the World Bank board where there was significant backtracking by developed countries and particularly led by the US to eliminate the climate portfolio targets of the World Bank Climate Action Plan. This is a significant setback for developing countries, and in light of the agreement and the new collective quantified goal for climate finance that was agreed about 2 years ago in Baku, it makes that agreement for the initial provision of 300 billion per year by 2035 very, very complicated. At the same time, we see also a week ago very, very disruptive negotiations at the board of the Green Climate Fund, in particular around the fact that since its pledging conference for its last replenishment 3 years ago, that fund has lost about $4 billion, where developed countries have withdrawn from their pledges, and in some cases, more recently, with one developed country reducing its pledged and signed commitment by 50%, which has seen another reduction of $1 billion of climate finance that was much needed for developing country, that has material impact on the ability of that fund to program. We've also seen 2 months ago the very unsatisfactory replenishment of the Global Environment Facility, also with a significant reduction of its allocation to the climate mitigation window of that fund. That fund was the oldest. What we're seeing is a very clear backtracking from developed countries on their obligations that are legally binding to support the provisions of climate finance to developing countries. At the same time, we see at this board meeting the reporting from the Secretariat that over 180 proposals have been received in this initial phase, representing the need from developing countries for access to finance to support and respond to loss and damage. And we know, as it's been said, is that the fund has only been able to agree to allocate about $250 million for projects at this point in time. We have a discussion that we expect to add another $100 million that is available for us to spend to those projects, potentially bringing the number of projects from about 10 to about 15, assuming they all average in the range of 20 million. But we know some countries have asked for a little bit less than that. So that number could increase up to about 20, depending on the average project size. Now, in addition to the start of the process to consider the requests in light of the decisions that have been made in Barbados a year ago, we also have key decisions at this board meeting in relation to the country support system for developing countries. So we agreed to have a system whereby developing countries could access, at least in this period, a rather small amount of funding for preparatory work to prepare funding requests, to prepare and develop national systems for loss and damage, to undertake consultations with stakeholders, and to do a financial or economic analysis or assessments of their loss and damage needs. And we expect to have that system now fully up and running, with the first requests from countries coming in between August and September, and hopefully the board will agree to the delegated authority to the executive director, so those funding proposals would not need to come back to the board for approval, but can be dealt with under the authority invested in the executive director. So hopefully we'll see a little bit more technical support flowing to developing countries to help them prepare for project preparation and other processes related to loss and damage. We also expect the board to discuss the fund's resource mobilization strategy, which looks at the key issue of how to fully address the needs of developing countries as presented in the number of funding requests that have been submitted, which is roughly between $2 to $3 billion in the interim phase, as well as then making sure that we're converting all the pledges that were made in Dubai at the COP into legal agreements so that we can have money to be able to spend in the fund. And then also as part of that discussion is the really important transition from this interim phase, what we call the BIM phase, to the long-term model of the fund, and then in particular how the board prepares for the very important first initial replenishment of the fund, and the expectation that there'll be a process established that would lead to the development of funding scenarios and in relation to how to address more substantive needs, and we hope that this process also starts to talk about how do we scale up the funding support to countries from the sort of 20 million envelope that we have now per project to much higher needs and much more higher project specific articulations. We also have really important discussions on the long-awaited policy on observers to clarify the specific role that observers play in our fund as articulated in our governing instrument, and we expect further deliberations at this board meeting on those matters. We also have the very important accountability documents to our parent bodies under the UNFCCC convention, and so we have to annually report to the COP and the CMA, the parties that will meet again later this year in Turkey for COP31 on our progress towards implementing our governing instrument and the goals that have been set for us by the parties. We also have just the general administrative run of the show where we would agree on an additional budget allocation for the Secretariat to allow the Secretariat to continue to grow and hire staff and undertake activities. There are also one or two other agenda items that are related to, as part of the agreement in Dubai on establishing the fund, we agreed to have a once a year annual dialogue that we would coordinate alongside the Office of the United Nations Secretary General that brings together key players in the funding arrangements, what we call the other funds that are involved in the loss and damage space, to talk about collaboration and cooperation. So we expect to also approve the scope and terms of the format for that event, which may take place later this year. So we have a very busy agenda for our 3 formal days of meetings. We also have the continuation of a practice that started many board meetings ago, where we have a dedicated dialogue with civil society organizations for the purpose of that agenda item is for the board to hear directly from civil society organizations in relation to their priorities and needs, and to allow for a direct dialogue between the board members and civil society organizations. So I think those are just in some of the priority issues for developing countries. Again, of really importance to us is the fund continues to evolve its systems and continues to discuss how to better operationalize its governing instrument with the purpose of serving developing countries and responding to the urgent and important problem of loss and damage, which, by the way, at least in my continent, again, we've learned in the last few days of extreme flooding events in West Africa and also in the country of Ghana, which is also the chair of the African group at this time. So I mean, for us and for colleagues that are on the ground in West Africa, I mean, this is a daily reality. Loss and damage is not a future scenario in a science fiction book. It's a daily reality for people living in developing countries, and it's a daily reality for communities living on the front line. So many of us, alongside our colleagues that are on this call from civil society, have worked for decades to have this fund, and we will continue to push for the achievement of its objectives and for this fund to serve the developing country populations that are most impacted by climate change. So thank you very much, Harjeet. I'm happy to take questions when you need it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, and especially for giving us a very critical boardroom perspective and highlighting the policy issues that we'll be dealing with in the next few days. And thank you so much also for your highlights about the reality, the brutal reality that we face on the ground. And this is a proper segue. We know that when super typhoons or such disasters hit, communities cannot afford to just wait for funds and also deal with international red tape, as we see when we set up these funds. And that's why we talk about direct budgetary support for countries and dedicated windows that can help this money reach communities. And to speak much more on these ground realities, I invite Tetet to talk about the context in the Philippines. Tetet, over to you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Harjeet, and thank you very much, Richard, for that scene-setting presentation for all of us. No, so the ninth board meeting of the FRLD happens tomorrow, just as the Philippines is bracing itself for Super Typhoon Inday. The international name is Bavi, after wreaking havoc in the U.S. Pacific Islands of Northern Marianas and Guam. Super Typhoon Inday is not expected to make landfall over the Philippine landmass, but it will maintain its super typhoon strength until Thursday. So, storms have become so strong that they do not need to hit land to cause devastation. And studies show that the barrage of typhoons have been supercharged by climate change. With about 18 to 20 typhoons per year, the Philippines is one of the most frequently and severely affected countries worldwide. The Philippines is on the front line of climate change. I've seen it getting worse since I was a child. Every year, the impacts get worse. Typhoons are more destructive, heat waves are hotter, and rising sea levels are threatening coastal communities and cities. This reality is not just for my country, but it is also the situation for other developing countries in Africa, Asia, Caribbean, Latin America, and the Pacific, as what Richard has just mentioned that is happening in Africa at the moment. So the climate crisis brings immediate as well as long-term challenges, burdens on developing countries and communities. Recovery is a very long and uphill climb, sometimes taking 10 to 15 years, because climate impacts are an additional layer of challenge on top of already heavy debt burdens, fragile infrastructure, reliance on climate-sensitive sectors such as agriculture, fishing, etc. So the widespread destruction of infrastructure, power grids, transportation networks, the disruption in agricultural production, these all require costly reallocation of budgets away from the provision of social services such as housing, education, and health. And usually they cause shortages and spikes in prices of commodities. So, for communities, we have to confront the multiple challenges of climate impacts, again, on top of the daily challenges of survival amidst poverty, unemployment, landlessness, etc. So, it goes without saying that developing countries and communities need support for the impacts of a crisis that they contributed so very little to. However, multilateral climate funds often they bypass vulnerable communities. And so the FRLD needs to be the game changer that it says it will be and put communities front and center. Now, We want this fund to succeed. So we're arguing for two things here at the FRLD in that respect. First is direct budget support so that national or subnational entities become accredited to receive finance directly from the fund without having to go through an international intermediary. The goal of such direct access is, among other things, to acknowledge and respect a country's sovereignty to manage its own affairs, its own systems, reduces administrative overhead and transaction costs, and enhance national ownership. Second, and very close to our hearts, is community direct access to climate funds because local populations experience the impacts first and worst. By having communities apply for and receive support for reconstruction, rehabilitation, to pick up the pieces after devastating events, local knowledge is harnessed in terms of correctly identifying the needs and how to mobilize people's support and talents. The inclusion of otherwise marginalized voices shifts decision-making power to the people for policies and initiatives that directly concern their lives and livelihoods. There will be local ownership, which is indispensable for the success of any initiative. As the saying goes, nothing about us without us. And we don't believe there's no money to fund loss and damage. There is money going around, but they fund wars and militarism. And civil society and social movements are here to continue to push the FRLD board members to move us closer to financing climate justice. Thanks very much. Back to you, Harjeet.
Thank you so much, Tatit. And particularly your intervention underscoring why community-led access is a matter of survival and also rights and not just a policy preference. And to back up this call for accessible finance, definitely we need to make sure that we have data and we have got the systems in place. And this demand from developing countries and the kind of proposals we have received clearly tell us how big the need is. And to break that down further, and show us how massive funding gap is in the startup phase. To begin with, the Barbados implementation modalities. I'm welcoming Brandon Wu. Brandon, if you can give us a reality of this 2.8 billion pipeline and the gap that exists, and just put that in context for us. Over to you, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you, Harjeet. Well, you've pretty much said it. Richard also mentioned it, and then Tatet at the end. So I won't need to take very long. But as Harjeet just mentioned, for the first 2-year pilot phase of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, known as the Barbados Implementation Modalities, or the BIM, the call for proposals was opened up by the funds during the COP30 negotiations last year, so about 8 months ago. And at this point, we've learned that there are 176 proposals being considered by the Secretariat now, and the total cost of those proposals together is $2.8 billion. Now, we know that's not reflective of the full scope of demand, of course. The proposals, as Richard mentioned, are only allowed to be a maximum of $20 million each. So these are intended to be pretty small scale proposals for this pilot phase. And also, of course, countries have only had a few months to put them together. So it's clear that the demand is enormously larger than 2.8 billion, but this is just our starting point for this fund. And I should note also, this is without looking at immediate recovery needs. We know that can reach tens of billions of dollars for individual acute events, but those sorts of needs aren't really addressed by this project-based funding model that we're using for the BIM phase. Now, even that 2.8 billion, which is, of course, is a small slice of the overall need, that compares to what's available to the fund right now, which, as Richard mentioned, is $250 million for the BIM phase. So that's an order of magnitude less than the projects that are the proposals that are already in the pipeline. The four proposals that are potentially on the table for consideration at this meeting alone would use up a third of that amount, the 250 million that's been allocated for this 2-year pilot period. And even if the board were to approve a small increase in that figure, Richard mentioned maybe adding 100 million to it. The context of this is that less than $500 million has actually been received by the funds altogether to date, even though it was created several years ago at this point. It's been open for pledges for several years. And just to put that number into context, $500 million is the amount that was reported that President Trump in the US gave a no-bid contract to a construction firm to build the White House ballroom that he wants built. $500 million is about what the US spent daily on sustained operations during the war in Iran, not even at the peak of that war. At the peak, at the beginning, it was over $1 billion per day. Another way to look at it is to look at the bigger numbers. So the US budget bill last year saved Amazon $8 billion in corporate tax in 1 year, and that's on a tax bill that's already shockingly low. That same budget bill spent $200 billion on immigration enforcement. That was new money. That was not money that had existed before. The administration is requesting $1.5 trillion in military budget for the next fiscal year, which is a 50% increase on already historic levels. And so that really all of that just goes to Tet's point, which is that the money is out there. And it's disingenuous for the rich countries to say otherwise. I want to close by saying that the lack of resources here, that 500 million, less than $500 million that this fund has available, and not just for programming, but also for the administrative budget, for the overhead costs that the World Bank is charging, all of that stuff. It's less than 500 million available in total. That really shapes the ambition of the conversations that the board can have. We're much more likely to get mired in difficult conversations about allocation. How are we going to pick between 176 proposals when we have enough money for 10? Rather than having proactive conversations about how to make the fund as innovative as possible, or how to make the fund as responsive to the needs of communities as possible. And so as we do the technical work here at the FRLD board, we can't forget that political reality of rich countries' refusal to pay their fair share, even though that's not necessarily something this board itself can address directly, that really does overshadow everything. And if we're not careful, it can do lasting harm to this fund even before it gets off the ground by limiting its ambition from the start.
Thank you so much, Brandon. And of course, right now the conversation is about $2.8 billion, the immediate urgent request that we have received from developing countries. But let's also remember, we need at least $400 billion annually in developing countries alone to rebuild the kind of damages that we are seeing. And this is the result, this number is a result of several studies that we have seen. So clearly we need trillions if we put it together. And we are looking at an astronomical gap, which we just can't ignore. And thank you for putting that into context when you compare these numbers. The fact is, the world is way richer now and unfortunately much more unequal. Right. So we are at a stage where we will see some funding moving, but we also know that we have not fixed everything in the fund at this moment. And we still face many institutional hurdles surrounding the hosting arrangement that we have with the World Bank, which also threatens its flexibility, independence, and direct access. So to unpack these bureaucratic challenges, I'm going to invite Liana Sheltek, who is the Associate Director, as you know, at Henrik Boll, and she has been following many such funds. So, Liana, you have 5 minutes to unpack some of these challenges. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Harjeet. And it's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon and good evening to all of you. And I basically want to pick up on some of the points that have been made, namely what the fund needs to be able to fund at scale, but also its speed and to provide the access that we need. And my colleague Ted has pointed out how in particularly community access is one of the features that we are looking at. But what we are seeing right now is even how complicated some funding arrangements under the funding modalities for the initial startup phase have been for the Barbados implementation modalities. And this is very much linked, and I think it's important that we do spell that out, to the fact that we have that hosting arrangements of the Secretariat hosted by the World Bank of a financial intermediary fund for the FRLD with the World Bank as a trustee. And this is a setup. I want to remind folks that civil society colleagues have actually cautioned against in the context of the transitional committee, the design phase for the fund, where we actually felt that that setup could be an impediment and is proving to be very difficult to overcome for the kind of innovative financing features that we want to see. Just as a reminder, and Brandon has mentioned that from civil society, we are not just some of the strongest advocates for the fund, and we do that outside of the fund. We have an action tomorrow, and we do that inside of the boardroom. But we are also technical analysts. We actually engage with the documents. We engage with some of the setup, and we try to actually find ways to work with the board to improve actually some of those features. So what we are seeing under the BIM is actually the two specified modalities, access modalities, namely rapid release and community grants as dedicated access modalities, are not even yet considered. And of course, the BIM is a startup phase. So we'll have to see how, for example, to what extent community access features in some of the proposals, including the ones that are coming to the board, as the first one that have been assessed under the BIM, but also the other ones that are in the pipeline. But even though the FRLD has very much attempted to do things differently and innovatively, I want to point out, for example, that the FRLD does not have its own accreditation procedures for implementing partners, but actually is relying on the accreditation assessment and the system of its sister multilateral climate funds, the GEF, the GCF, the adaptation fund, as a matter of speeding, not only speeding up, but also expanding the partner spectrum that the fund can be working with. We are repeatedly reminded of the complications that are caused by the hosting agreement between the World Bank and the FRLD, and including also for the Secretariat. And this is already popping up in a number of ways as we are trying to actually get the startup phase and the BIM, the Barbados implementation modalities on the ground. For example, one of the innovative funding modalities and something that developing countries are really setting a lot of their hopes in, namely the direct access to direct budget support for national government entities. And again, Ted mentioned it, only at the last board meeting at B8, we found kind of a very complicated workaround procedure to even make that possible. In the call for proposal, it was very clear that countries weren't quite sure whether they could even submit for direct budget support. And this is complicated because of the requirements and the approach on fulfilling the trustee agreement, fulfilling the agreement of working with the World Bank as the trustee. Ultimately, it comes down to a question once you have a funded activity of who signs the funding agreement, if it's the trustee or whether it should be the board. In some of the other funds, for example, in the adaptation fund, it's the board co-chair or a board member who can sign on behalf of the fund. And with the World Bank as potentially signer of those funded agreement, it's very clear that the World Bank has been put much more interest in ensuring that its own credit rating and risk rating doesn't take a hit than in trying to facilitate funding to affected countries and communities. And some of the outgrowths of that hosting agreement lead to very strange things, like, for example, the fact that the Secretariat of a fund whose main task should be to technically assess and bring funding proposals to the board, because Secretariat staff is World Bank, our World Bank employees are actually prohibited by the trustee agreement, or by the hosting agreement, sorry, not the trustee agreement, by the hosting agreement, to do more than basically a completeness check of whether all the documents have been received under what needs to be submitted for a funding proposal, while then under the BIM, you have a bunch of external consultants that are actually doing the technical assessment. Now, stuff like that has obviously long-term implication, including for the long-term operational model of the fund, when actually the core task of the fund has to be outsourced to consultant because of the hosting agreement. And we are particularly very, very worried what that not only does to the core capacity of the fund, but whether that particularly makes it even possible to do things like community access, small community grants, which currently are probably very much complicated to that setup. This is one of the reasons, and Richard mentioned that we have the country support system here as one of the possible considerations and approvals, including the operationalization of those smaller grants of 250K for technical support, which is supposed to be done through a delegation of decision-making on those individual grants to the executive director instead of going to the board. This is why we are watching that very closely, trying to see what kind of hurdles are going to come up or might need to overcome, or whether they can be overcome in the BIM setup, because that might give us an indication whether it's even possible to have that small grant provision, the community grant provision that we so absolutely need. And again, I just want to point out, we've warned against the setup with the World Bank. This is an interim arrangement. Technically, it needs to go back to the COP and the CMA at COP 33 to see whether the World Bank has fulfilled conditions that were part of the approval of the operationalization of the fund in 2020 at COP 2028. And at least from our perspective, the World Bank has not kept up its end of the bargain that was struck when we agreed in the transitional committee that they would facilitate direct access. We don't see any of that so far. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Liana, Brandon, Tetet, and Richard, for really laying that out, and everyone. The effort that we have made here is to provide a full picture, starting with the board negotiations to real world impacts, and also telling how the pipeline is 11 times oversubscribed, and of course some of the structural barriers that we face because of the roadblocks put forth now by the World Bank, where we do say, we told you so. And so clearly the mandate for the board this week is massive. And yeah, we would now like to open the floor to our colleagues from the media first, and requesting journalists, please raise your virtual hand or type questions. Yeah, you can actually speak, that's better. And if your question is directed to a particular panelist, let us know. Over to you. So the journalists first.
Hi, Harjeet, can I speak?
Megan, I see your hand. I don't see any other hand. Please start.
I think Seema was trying to speak.
Please go ahead, Megan.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks very much for this really helpful update on everything. I just had a couple of technical questions, I suppose. Well, one technical question for Richard about the forthcoming meeting and the proposals that are on the table there. So these 4 proposals that are going to be up for consideration, how have those been selected for this particular meeting? I wasn't sure about that. And then on the question about the replenishment process, as you said, the GCF, which kind of has a sort of orthodox replenishment process, a 4-year cycle, and then has had problems with countries not delivering on the pledges, especially given the current state of play for climate finance and in donor countries cutting back. Is the Loss and Damage Fund going to consider a different type of replenishment process to try and avoid these types of issues? And just one very small technical question: is direct access possible at this point at all? I wasn't sure on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Megan. I don't see any further hand, and request is to please raise your hand or write your question in the chat. Over to you, Richard, and then anybody else can substantiate. Richard, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Megan, for those questions. So the selection of the proposals that have been presented to the board at this meeting were done in accordance with the agreed procedures developed by the board, that the Secretariat would shortlist, they would do the completeness check of all proposals, and then they would select Tier 1 and Tier 2 proposals that meet a certain set of criteria, and particularly to identify those projects that are more mature, are more evolved. And that's how we got to these 4 proposals. I would say that I probably expect the board to communicate to the international community that how we've addressed these proposals and how we've considered the broader matters of the current selection of projects of the 178, and that will become clearer following our conversations that we started today in the informal discussion, where there seems to be a convergence by the board on how to approach the matter of the funding, the consideration of funding proposals and the matters related to how that process is going to unfold. So
Richard, it seems your network is.
So right now we're not actually.
Richard, we lost you for about 10 seconds. If you can.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on the replenishment, we're very much need to when we set up this interim initial phase, we agreed that it would work concurrently with the board's discussion on the long-term model. Now, the long-term model is essentially to implement what has been agreed in the governing instrument that's not currently being applied because it requires further consideration. And so we hope that this board meeting adopts the first phase of the resource mobilization strategy, and then starts to do work clarifying how we're going to implement what has already been agreed, and how that then sequences into a more long-term replenishment model. So right now, we're not actually discussing how the model of replenishment will work. I believe there's enough experience out there from the international community on how these processes work. Some good models, some bad models, but there's pretty much a standard a way of replenishing funds and the process that leads to that. And so I don't see at this point in time the loss and damage fund deviating from existing models, but there's always scope for innovation in the process and to make it better. In terms of we have both direct access through entities that have been accredited as national regional entities from the other funds, as well as we have the process for doing direct budget support via direct access through national governments, and we have processes to make that happen. Obviously, the process that is direct access through existing entities, national or regional entities from other funds, is a little bit more evolved and quicker to operationalize, while the direct budget support modality was only approved at the last meeting, and there's still some further issues that need to be discussed or operationalized in relation to the World Bank, the agreement that we have in the trustee agreement around how that would work. So that may take a little bit longer. But again, it's just really continue discussions on how to operationalize the decision of the board, and not to we're not reopening that decision. It's just to how to affect it. So I hope I've answered those questions on those ones. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Yes, you have. There are some follow-up questions. I'll first bring Arshit. Arshit, you can come in, and then there are 2 questions in the chat. And I encourage Akshit and Hannah, if you want to speak to your questions, please feel free to come in after. Arshit, over to you.
I'm a reporter with Carbon Pulse. Just broader questions regarding negotiations at COP31. So how does this failure that you described of developed countries to adequately capitalize the fund, how do you think it will affect wider negotiations ahead of COP31? Also, if you could talk about underfunding of the fund spilling over into other negotiation tracks. Are developing countries likely to become less willing to compromise on mitigation, NDC ambition, or Article 6 if finance commitments continue to fall short? That's it from me.
Thank you, Arshit. Akshit, would you like to speak to your question, or we use it from the chat?
No, I just ask it here itself. Thank you, Harjeet. I just wanted to get a little more understanding of the challenges for rapid release of funding and community access because of the hosting of the fund secretariat by the World Bank. I just wanted to understand a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Akshit. And there's a question from Hannah, which Brandon has responded. And Hannah, if you have any follow-up question, either you can ask now or put it in the chat as you are comfortable. Okay, my request is, Richard, people would like to benefit from your presence. So if you can respond to those questions first of Ashrit and Akshit, and then I can also bring in Liana, Brandon, and others. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. So I mean, the money that we have available was the money that was pledged as part of the adoption of the governing instrument decision in Dubai, and that was roughly $800 million, $800+ million that were pledged then, of which only 498 million of those pledges are confirmed, as in we have that money in the trust fund and therefore able to spend, right? And so when we took the decision in Barbados to allocate 250 million, it was with that understanding we had even less money at that time in the bank, right? So pledges are just pledges. We can't really allocate decisions or funding decisions based on money that's been pledged. We can only allocate money towards money that's in the trust fund. And that's why we decided in Barbados to allocate further amounts of money. I think the expectation of myself and my fellow co-chair at the time was that we would at least double that amount to 500 million. And in hindsight, we probably expected that there would be a lot of oversubscription of requests, but I don't think the extent that we thought that we would get 178 funding proposals, of which that number is, I mean, that number is not necessarily the best number to go from. I think there's probably in the range of what's ready in the pipeline, probably only about 80 to 90 projects. Many of them are duplicated requests where countries have submitted requests under multiple access avenues, right? And of that, there's a large number of requests that fall within those submitted by the UN agencies. And so the actual amount of money that's going requested directly for direct access or direct budget support is probably below 40 or below 50 in itself, which is the priority of this fund. That doesn't mean that countries that chose the UN route should be penalized, but it just makes it lots more complicated on if you look at the other examples of other funds, the Adaptation Fund decided to put a cap on the number of multilateral projects in order to protect the space for direct access entities. And then you look at the GCF where we didn't have that type of approach to protect the direct access entities. And so the GCF has a current scenario of having roughly between 113 to 120 direct access entities that have been accredited, but only through its work program of the board of the Secretariat approves only 19 projects for those entities on an annual basis. That means that if you're one of those 119 entities, you may wait 5 to 6 years before you have one funding request, and then the funding requests are generally much lower than those of the multilateral funds or the multilateral development banks or the UN agencies or even the bilateral funds. So we don't have any of those provisions, and that was because we didn't believe that we should do that right now, given the limited availability of resources for this. So hopefully at this board meeting, we can increase that envelope from 250 to 350, and then we can continue to see how we can maximize once we have the full $800 million in the bank account. We have to also secure money for the Secretariat operations because we have to pay for the work to be done. It's quite a sizable chunk of work, and our full praise to the Secretariat for getting us this far. It's a very difficult task. So what that means is that, even if we assume that we would be able to program 50 projects in addition to the 20 that may do right now, that's still going to take a good 1.5 to 2 years for the Secretary to handle those requests from the analysis that they need to provide to the board. We only meet 3 times a year, so that's quite a large size of approvals for the board. Where this is not a board that's just going to rubber stamp what the Secretariat gives us, and none of the other boards do that either. So we have a very important responsibility as board members to make sure that the funding requests are particularly related to loss and damage. I think the other funds, such as the Adaptation Fund and the GCF and the adaptation portfolio, have a much easier task than we do. We have to be specific to say this event is in response to a loss and damage event, or this is in preparation of future loss and damages. So there's a level of technical specificity that we're going in sort of blind to the process of approvals, and we don't have a lot of experience from other funds dealing with this work. So we are, this is the context that we're in, and therefore that's why we wanted to have a resource mobilization strategy. I did make a specific proposal in the consultations with the board that we should consider a high-level pledging event, either alongside or between the United Nations General Assembly session this year, which would be the last one of the current Secretary General, and the COP process, to see if we can close the gap or create a greater convergence between the demands of country and the availability of resources. That doesn't mean we would be asking for 2.8 billion, as Brandon had suggested, is the full value of the proposals, but more closer to a doubling of the Dubai pledges might be more realistic in terms of the capabilities and capacities of the Fund Secretariat and the board. What this means for the broader finance negotiations, I don't think this is an indicator of success or failure of those negotiations. I think what we're seeing, as I mentioned, the total removal of climate portfolio targets by the World Bank, and what that may mean for other multilateral development banks, which will probably follow the same suit as the World Bank. And so if we see the same removal of climate portfolio targets in the African Development Bank and the Asia Development Bank and the Latin American Development Bank, because the US is still a primary shareholder in many of those funds, then we have a total systemic backtracking of the use of climate portfolio targets in the MDBs. Now, that has a significant impact. The same with the GCF replenishment. I think the expectation that we've been talking to our board members is that we're looking at a negative replenishment at this GCF, the next GCF level, and that may be from where they were. The pledged amount last period was $12 billion. It's probably going to be more closer to $5 or $6 billion. Particularly, we're seeing hesitations from other major top 5 donors. We've seen the UK reduced by 50% their pledge to the GCF, but they still remain one of the top 5. We're hearing concerns that Japan is rethinking also its contribution to the GCF. So what you're seeing is that the obligation under the Convention and Paris Agreement for developed countries to provide support is being significantly eroded, and that means that developing countries have no support to rely on, and therefore their ambitions would be conditional, right? Rather than the countries proposing ambition with the expectation that there would be support. What this means for upcoming negotiations on the just transition mechanism is probably not very encouraging. That we know that no like loss and damage finance, the actual transition for the large majority of developing countries to more to less emitting climate resilient development pathways is going to require, again, the trillions and billions, and countries are now going to be expected to continue their pathways with very little support or very little clarity on how much they can expect to receive from the international community. Again, I don't want to sound like a doomsday prophet on this one, but I do think that the reality that the $300 billion target under the NCQG and then the subsequent 1.3 trillion mobilization target is deeply at risk. And those targets were to 2035, which is when the sort of NDC cycle. So what we'll see is as we go to the GST in 2 years' time, and then the subsequent resubmission of updated NDCs by 2030, is you're probably going to see less ambition because developing countries are not able to rely on the international community for that support, despite rulings that we've seen from the International Court of Justice in their opinion that was very clear about the obligation of developed countries. And again, it's just not realistic to assume that developing countries can adapt to climate change and to transition their economies to be more low emissions without significant support from developed countries that are more advanced. Again, we have all these competing priorities. I think Tet mentioned the fact that, not only does loss and damage have a significant burden on existing allocations to health and education and housing and infrastructure. Again, we see that also if we don't resolve what support comes for just transitions. I can't see developing countries being willing participants any longer in the regime that keeps to put burdens on their ability to grow, and so I think the resulting likelihood is increased emissions from all countries. And so rather than decreasing keeping the temperature below 1.5 or significantly below 1.5, we are looking at massive overshoots, and what that means is more loss and damage. So I don't think that we're seeing very positive.
It seems the network at Richard's place is playing up a little bit. We are on top of the hour. I suggest we stay for 10 more minutes because we have
to conflict
or sorry, Richard, we lost you for about 10 seconds. If you can, we lost again.
Can you see me?
Yeah, you're back now. So if you can wrap up, if you can just say the last couple of lines.
Yeah, so I think that the situation for developing countries and the climate system is quite dire right now, and we would need to see a lot more trust building in the process and a lot more support to developing countries as they participate equally in this global climate regime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. And as Tetet is saying in the chat, the reason it's happening is because there's already a thunderstorm, and we are right in the middle of a situation where super typhoon is having its impact. And I'm suggesting we stay 10 more minutes to deal with this question that Akshit has asked. And I'm going to request Liana, who touched upon some of the challenges related to the World Bank. What are the challenges for rapid release of funding and community access because of the secretariat hosted by the World Bank? So, Liana, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to come in really, really quickly, just as a quick follow-up on Richard, to point out, obviously, the backtracking that we expecting in the multilateral development banks, which have gotten a huge role, right? A huge expectation of their contribution to the NCQG. But I want to point out, and particularly in the context of the affected countries and communities that we are talking about it, we should not forget that really the most highly concessional climate finance, the one that provides the broadest eligibility to developing countries, is actually funding that goes through the UNFCCC fund, including the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage as an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. This is why it's so important that not just anything is funded. And we heard in the GCF meeting, in the last GCF meeting, basically a number of developed countries say, yes, we might have some obligation, but we can choose where we are putting our money, and that money might not go to the GCF, or it might not go to the FRLD, but because of the concessionality, the access and the eligibility, it's really, really important to defend and strengthen and scale up the multilateral climate fund and not allow them to be denuded and defunded. And that goes back to the question of access that I wanted to bring in when basically hosting agreement was negotiated. It was basically initially under the Financial Intermediary Fund Directive that the World Bank has, and that started out very clearly indicating that they normally fund or engage only with multilateral development banks, UN agencies, and the IMF basically as implementation partner, because their systems are trusted. They are kind of quality certified by the World Bank. And so this is how they normally set it up. Then as part of the TC, there was a lot of focus on facilitating and ensuring direct access, which is a distinguishing feature of the Adaptation Fund, which pioneered it, and the GCF, which brought it to scale, at least in terms of accredited entities, even if not yet in funding provision or in funding disbursement. And it was very clear that that was a condition of basically being hosted by the World Bank and saying, you need to look basically beyond your traditional directive and need to make it able for direct access entities to come in. Now that we have succeeded by the fact that the board basically has certified through the fact that those entities are accredited with other funds, that they are fulfilling functional equivalency, particularly from fiduciary standards that are important for the trustee to basically be willing to sign any funding arrangements with basically projects that are coming in. However, this will be impossible. I mean, most of the communities, community-based organizations never going to be able to go through an accreditation process. This is obviously also one of the challenges that we have with other funds, which is for the fund to actually be able to think about filling with life the modalities for community access. It needs to be innovative, and that innovation is hampered by an approach that actually relies and insists on that functional equivalency that is actually not possible to be fulfilled by community organizations. There are a couple of more layers to it. As I said, it will be very important to see whether delegation to the executive director and the smaller amounts might fulfill the possibility, kind of piloting that approach. But again, from our perspective, this is a core condition that needs to be fulfilled for us to say, yes, the World Bank is the right partner to make sure that the fund is as innovative and is as supportive of the needs of communities as can be. And that's at least something that we as civil society are going to continue to be watching. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Liana. And Akshat, we can connect you with all the panel members so that you can ask follow-up questions. We are out of time, so we won't be able to
Sure.
take many questions, but we can bilaterally speak later. I just want to check if anybody,
Sure.
any of the panelists would like to come in quickly. I see Lynn already responded to Seema's question. I can add a line later, but if anybody else wants to come in, please come in. We have 2 more minutes.
Yeah, maybe just to Seema's question in the chat, just to be clear, the fund has not I'm hearing it. Thank you, Harjeet. The fund has not actually funded any programmatic work yet, right? The 4 proposals that are in front of the board at this meeting, if the board chooses to approve them, those would be the first actual work that the FRLD has funded. So we don't actually have a portfolio to look at so far. That said, if you look at, for example, the Jamaica proposal that's in front of the board, there's a fairly explicit mention of non-economic loss and damage and how it needs to be integrated into response, in that particular proposal. So that may give a sense, and we can put the link to that in the chat.
Thank you. Tetet, if you want to say something, and also could be your closing comment. Yeah, sorry, we're just out of time. I can simply add a line saying we should credit the board that the issue of non-economic loss and damage has been discussed equally as we talk about the contemporary or usual impacts. Similarly, I must also say we also talk about slow onset events alongside extreme weather events. So that conversation is very live, and board is very aware of the fact that we have to very proactively support activities under non-economic loss and damage. I'm going to now wrap it up. And again, a lot has been said, but just to highlight a couple of things. And to also credit, the board has been working really hard. If you compare with many other funds, the speed has been there. But of course, when we look at the scale of impacts on ground, communities are not getting the support. So we still have a huge gap in scale, speed, and access. And you heard from Tetet about the importance of community access and the need for direct access. And Richard talked about resource mobilization strategy and the idea of having a pledging conference to meet the very immediate gap that exists, also being mindful of the capacity of the secretariat. And then there are some of the roadblocks. And if I can add to what Liana said, World Bank made all the promises to become the trustee and host the secretariat, and they cannot now go back on their words and start imposing its own policies and processes to create new roadblocks. And the board must deal with that intention, which is now kind of creeping in. So which is so fundamental for us to make sure that we have direct access and community access. So it's an important week, and board, I'm sure, is going to work really hard to resolve all the issues. And as civil society will continue to highlight these challenges and also work very closely with the board to support them on the work that they are doing. So stay tuned. And if you have any follow-up questions, please write to me, and I'm happy to connect you with all the panelists so that you can ask follow-up questions. And thank you very much, Richard, Liana, Tetet, Brandon, and all of you for your participation and engagement. Thank you again.